5 after, but I'm going to go ahead and get started today. Get a minute early start. And that way, if we finish early, then you have more time to run to the restroom and do all that kind of stuff. So, I couldn't help to think as Ron came in a minute ago, Ron, we really need you here next week when we're talking about Jacob and the selecting of the breeding of sheep and all that stuff. I mean, I'm sure you can add a lot of help to us on that subject. So we're in Genesis 29, and again, the scriptures will be up here, but if you want to follow along in your own Bibles, we're going to be at the end of that chapter as we start today, because last week we left the situation with Jacob now being married to 2 wives. One that he absolutely adored, and the other one that he had been tricked into marrying. And even if you don't know the story, you know this is already a recipe for disaster, right? And it doesn't disappoint us in that way either. So as we pick up the reading at the end of chapter 29, let's appreciate the very human story that this is. Sometimes we try to glamorize the Bible. And so and I understand why with our kids we teach them a little bit differently than we would teach this passage in here. But we come away with the romanticized versions of a story when really it's raw stuff going on. Each sister has what the other sister wants. Rachel wants to have children. And Leah has no problem with that. Leah wants the affection of her husband, and Rachel has no problem with that. So both of them want what the other sister has, and each of them go away seeking their happiness in unhealthy ways. And yet, even in the midst of all of that, God continues to work through the foolishness, and He continues to work through the unhappiness and the mess to bring about His purposes, which I believe is what Romans 8:28 is talking about. So today's section deals with the births of Jacob's children, and you might think, well, that's a dry subject to talk about. But actually, Moses does an incredible job of writing this story. If you buy into the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. By the way, nothing ever tells us that. It's old history. It's old tradition. And I believe that he probably did. But I just wanted to throw that in. But he writes this in a very well-crafted way. It can't be totally in order, because what he's wanting to do here is he's wanting us to see the competition between the 2 sisters. But as I'll talk more about toward the end of the lesson, we're talking about a 7-year span here. We're going to have 13 babies born in a 7-year span. And so it's not in order, okay? That's not his purposes for the way he's telling this story. It's to show us this intense competition that's taking place. So let's begin in chapter 29 and verse 31, where it says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, He enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless." Now, this is the first time the Lord has been mentioned since the Stairway to Heaven story back in chapter 28. And the phrase "the Lord saw" is a common phrase, particularly in the Pentateuch, in the book of Genesis. In the first 5 books of the Bible. And it seems to always introduce God's action toward the weak or God's action toward the needy? I meant to ask you this and I forgot. It's Yahweh Rapha, right? I hadn't reviewed this in a long time, but that's the God who sees, right? Yahweh Rapha is the word that's introduced to us in the story of Hagar. Thank you. I knew I should have checked. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've done these. El Rohi, is the name of that Hagar gives. Remember when she fled, had to leave Abraham, and she's out in the wilderness, and God sees her, and she names him El Rohi, the God who sees. And this is a common theme we see. It's when God is stepping in to take care of the weak or the needy. And so he notes that Leah is not loved. And the word often is translated, maybe your translation has it this way, that Leah was hated. Now, unfortunately, in preaching and teaching, sometimes we have said that in the Bible, hate means love less. And that is often true, but you've got to go with the context, okay? And here I do think that's what it means. I'm not going to say across the board that hated always means loved less. But in the context here, it is. To say that Jacob hated Leah isn't really accurate. Okay? The writer's making a comparison. So what does it mean? Well, in verse 30, we're told that Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. That doesn't mean when it says that she was not loved or that she was hated, it doesn't mean that Jacob and Leah had nothing to do with each other. Obviously, right? I mean, we're going to see that very clearly in this chapter. And it doesn't mean that he was physically abusive to her. It doesn't mean that he was verbally mean to her. It doesn't mean that he was outwardly cruel to her. But his affection, his attention is not toward her. It's toward Rachel. And so, Leah was not loved. He ignored her. He paid her no attention. He didn't notice her presence. He didn't notice her thoughts. Particularly, he did not notice her emotions. And so Leah's in a pathetic situation. She is in a marriage to a man who will not give her what she desperately craves. And we're going to see clearly this in the names that she is going to give her children in this chapter. But I want you to notice that God shows more favor to the one who is less favored. Does that sound kind of like a trend in the Bible to you? He favors the less favored one. He chooses the one that the world does not choose. Paul put it this way in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He said, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. And so knowing that, you and I better be very careful about showing favoritism. Because when we show favoritism, the likelihood is that we're setting ourselves up against God. Okay? So verse 31 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. Do you hear the desperation in her voice? First, I want you to notice that Leah names her sons. This is unusual in those times. The man was the one who named the kids. Leah names them. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that this shows just how disengaged Jacob was. Leah's going to name 3 of her first 4 sons with a reference to God. Her first son is Reuben. Reuben means see a son. And the birth of Reuben kindles this hope in Leah that maybe now Jacob and I will have an emotional bond, an emotional attachment because of this boy. Verse 33. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord has heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. The birth of Reuben had not resulted in her desired effect. It had not resulted in Jacob loving her, showing her affection. And so in her naming her second son Simeon, it means he hears. And she praises God that even though I'm not loved by my husband, I'm loved by God. That sounds like a good thing. I think she's looking for a good place. This tender response of a loving God toward her. Then verse 34 says, again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, now at last my husband will become attached to me. Notice that word, attached to me. I mean, this is the desire in marriage. This is God's intent in marriage, that a husband and wife be attached to each other. Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I've borne him 3 sons. So she named him Levi, after the blue jeans. No, actually, Levi means attached. I want you to really try today, and for us guys it'll be particularly difficult, but I want you to really try today to empathize with the desperation, the desperate emotional attachment that Leah wants to have with her husband. She's not asking for too much, folks. This is what God intends in marriage. She's not asking for too much. Verse 35. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. No mention here of hoping it will bring her closer to Jacob. So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Judah, the word means praise. At this point, it seems like she's at a healthy place. It's not going to last long, but she's at a healthy place right here. She doesn't express any hope for Jacob's love anymore. She just expresses a thanks to God for the way that he has blessed her. And is this a sign that she's coming to grips, coming to terms with the situation as it is? At least for now, it appears that way. So now, how many sons does she have? She has 4. And she, at this point at least, is going to be content. She's going to be grateful for that. She's content with the abundant love that Yahweh has shown her. And at this point, she stops having children. We're not told why. Did she become infertile for a while? Because we're going to see that she starts having kids again in just a few verses. But did she become infertile for a while? Or was it that this desire she had for her kids to actually bring her and Jacob closer together has pushed them even further apart? We don't know. Maybe the marital relationship between her, maybe the sexual relationship between her and Jacob just ceases for a while. Maybe he didn't care much for kids being in the tent. I don't know. But chapter 30 now, in verse 1 says, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. Okay, when God saw, back in chapter 29 and verse 31, what happened? When God saw the situation, he opened Leah's womb and she became pregnant. When Rachel sees the situation, she's filled with jealousy and envy and bitterness. And so she says, "Give me children or I'll die." It appears that Rachel is blaming Jacob for her being barren. "Give me children or I'll die." The irony is, how's Rachel going to die? In childbirth. Jacob's response to her is pretty harsh. Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who's kept you from having children?" Guys, how would your wife respond if you, in her situation of being barren, if you responded in such a way as this? His logic is right, but his attitude, his words, his tone are not helpful at all. And her demand to him probably struck a blow to his virility, struck a blow to his male ego, and so he strikes back. And the fact that he employed spiritually sounding language with this comes across to me as being somewhat passive-aggressive. You know, we can often be guilty ourselves of using pious, religious-sounding language to really cut a person to the core. And it's hard to argue against something that sounds spiritual or religious, isn't it? When Jacob's mother had been barren, Rebekah, his father Isaac had prayed for her, we're told in Genesis 25:21. We don't see any prayer mentioned here, do we? When Hannah was barren, 1 Samuel chapter 1, her husband Elkanah treats her with such tenderness and such affection. We don't see any of that here, do we? After that tender love story that we read about last week, Jacob and Rachel in chapter 29, this exchange right here is the only exchange we will see between them in the rest of the book of Genesis, in the rest of their story. This is the only exchange. And it's not a very good one, is it? Verse 3. Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." Do you already see red flags going up? This was the ancient equivalent of surrogate parenting. Before the day that science and technology makes it possible where you don't even have to have sexual relationships with somebody in order to be able to be pregnant. But there are parallels between this account and the account of Sarah back in Genesis chapter 16. But it's really very different. Sarah made the proposal to give Abraham her maidservant Hagar because she felt like they were helping God fulfill his promise. God's made this promise to Abraham that through him and his children, the world's going to be blessed. Maybe God needs our help here. But we don't see that right here. Jacob already has at this point how many children? 4. He's already got children that can propagate the promise of God. And this really, it's about Rachel's pride. It's about her jealousy. And so here we're seeing the early stages of the War of the Wives. And Rachel believes that any children born to Bilhah, her servant, will be credited to her. She and Leah, as we're going to see, they both see this as like a ball game. Verse 4. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. Because of this, she named him Dan. Dan means he has vindicated. Rachel's response, again, sounds spiritual. God has vindicated her. But actually, the name is more of an expression of her ego, her bitter struggle with her sister Leah. Verse 7. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So she named him Naphtali. Rachel describes her struggle with Leah here, and it sounds like a wrestling match, doesn't it? I mean, that's the verbiage that she uses. And who does she declare to be the winner? Herself. Now, how does she figure that? I mean, in my way of thinking, Rachel must have flunked first grade math. How can two surrogate children beat out 4 naturally born children? When's the last time that 2 beats 4? And I want you to notice that this time, Yahweh is not mentioned at all, nor is he praised. Verse 9. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what good fortune. So she named him Gad. You want to guess what Gad means? Good fortune. Good fortune. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, how happy I am. The woman will call me happy. Don't need to tell you what Asher means, do I? Leah reasons, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If she's going to give her servant to Jacob to have children, for me to keep up in this game, I'll give my servant to Jacob to have children. And so these kids are simply pawns in a chess game between these two sisters. The battle of the babies is on. And if you're keeping score, what's the score now? 6-2. These sisters have ceased appreciating that God has given each one of them. And the only thing they see is what they don't have. And jealousy always leads to strife. Sometime back, Rick Warren tweeted this. He said, envy is resenting God's goodness to others and ignoring God's goodness to me. Now we get into a weird part of the story. Verse 14. During wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Mandrake plants are particularly noted for their potent roots. And in fact, look at this picture. They're also noted for looking like some form of human being. There were actually old tales about when you pulled a mandrake root out of the ground, it would scream. I mean, can you see? Go back to the, yeah, can you see? I mean, it looks like a face, doesn't it? And the root itself is very potent, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but they're also the fruit of the tree. Go to the next slide. It looks like this. And both of these have all kinds of, they're narcotics. They are hallucinogens. And in ancient times, they were considered to be aphrodisiacs. Okay? They have a long history of being used in religious and superstitious practices. Aphrodite, who is the goddess of love in Greek mythology, Aphrodite was called the Lady of the Mandrake. So there was lots of rumor that went around about these mandrake plants. Okay, let's read on. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" Rachel wants these mandrakes to enhance her ability to conceive. She is thinking about them as an aphrodisiac. No, she's thinking of them as a drug that will help her to be able to conceive. Leah wants them to stimulate Jacob's desire for her. So Leah's wanting them as an aphrodisiac, okay? And Leah strongly rebukes Rachel here. And she makes no attempt to even cover how disgusted she is. Basically, what she's saying here is Jacob wants you and not me, and now you have the nerve to ask me for a fertility drug? He was my husband first, you know. And in fact, in this story, though it never says it, I really think Leah views herself as Jacob's legitimate wife, and she views Rachel as an outside, illegitimate lover. So, Rachel proposes this trade. "Very well," Rachel said, "he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." Jacob and Rachel shared a tent. Leah was outside of that. And so Rachel says, "Okay, we'll make a trade. You give me the mandrakes, Jacob goes to your tent tonight." This is just proof of how much Jacob favored Rachel over Leah and how desperate Rachel is for a child. And so, each sister gets what they think they want. Leah gets Jacob's affection for a night, and Rachel gets this superstitious herb in hopes that it will open her womb and she can have a child. Verse 16. "So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. 'You must sleep with me,' she said. 'I have hired you.'" Listen to that. It sounds like he's a prostitute. "I've hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. So Leah's night with Jacob resulted in what she wanted. She got pregnant. She wrongly interprets the meaning of this fifth son. She thinks this fifth son is actually God's blessing to her for giving her servant to Jacob. And even today, oftentimes people are too quick to credit God with successes that they get even through dishonest ways or in ways that are not God-honoring, and yet people are quick to give God credit for that, just as she's done. But Rachel remains barren. The superstitious mandrakes don't fulfill what they promise. Verse 19. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. What's the score now? 8-2, right? Then Leah said, God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him 6 sons. See, she's still thinking, by supplying Jacob with kids, I'll earn his affection. So she named him Zebulun. After 5 sons, you would think she would have gotten the message. And this just goes to show again how desperate she is for her husband's affection. And the longing in her heart doesn't go away simply because she has been so long disappointed. Now, what's obvious in this whole narrative is that Jacob has been no help to these sisters. Jacob has done nothing to help soften the rivalry. Jacob seems to be pretty much absent until it comes to baby making. Verse 21. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter. That's a bone that Moses is throwing to you ladies. That's just the way it was in the world of that time. She gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Now, with Dinah, Leah now has more children than all the others combined. Other daughters were born to Jacob and his wives. We see that in Genesis chapter 46 and verse 15. But Dinah is the only one that even gets named. Every son is named, but we're not given the names of anyone but Dinah. And I think the only reason she makes it is because Moses is setting us up, as he often does in the Pentateuch. He will introduce something and then it comes back just a little bit later in full story. And he's introducing her because when we get to chapter 34, she is the story of some tragic events. So verse 22 says, Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, May the Lord add to me another son. God remembered Rachel. Remember is another big word in the Pentateuch, particularly in Genesis. Chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, God remembered Noah and the ark. Does that mean God had forgotten about him? No. I'll come back to that. 1 Samuel 1:19, when Hannah is crying out to God about her barrenness, it says God remembered her and opened her womb. For God to remember in Scripture does not mean he's forgotten. This is called an anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. It's where God has given human characteristics so that we can understand a story better. These statements are always preludes to God then taking action. Okay? And in remembering Rachel, he takes action. He opens her womb. Now, as we're going to find out in verse 25, and I'll mention this as we begin, but I want you to see this. As we're going to see in verse 25, it tells us that at that point, Jacob finishes up his 7 years of service that he had agreed to give to Laban for Rachel, right? So he's now worked for Laban for 14 years. He finishes his 7 years. In that time, there have been 11 sons born and at least one daughter. And obviously, then, this would require that at least 2, if not more, of those 4 women were pregnant at any moment in that 7 years. Leah bore 6 sons and a daughter in 7 years. Now, some of you ladies had your kids pretty close together, but that's 6 times in 7 years. There's a lot about this family dynamic that kind of runs under the radar. It's things that we don't know for sure, but I think it's things that we can fairly safely assume are taking place. For instance, how do you think Zilpah and Bilhah feel in this whole situation? Being servants to these 2 sisters, having no decision or not even being asked if this is okay with them, to become surrogate moms. How do you think they felt? How do you think they felt toward Jacob? How do you think they felt toward Rachel and Leah? And what about the boys? You know that every one of those boys knew who their mama was. And do you think they didn't know the kind of turmoil and the kind of ranking that's taking place in this family? This whole thing is a recipe for disaster, as is every other polygamous marriage in the book of Genesis. More and more I'm hearing today people trying to defend polygamy. It's not running rampant in our country, but I'm at least beginning to hear people argue, hey, the Bible doesn't say that polygamy is wrong. Well, it doesn't. What's God's will for marriage? That a man, singular, leaves his father and mother and becomes united with his wife, one person. That's God's ultimate will for marriage. Never do you hear God endorsing the polygamy that takes place. He's able to use these people in those situations, but he never endorses it because it's a recipe for disaster. God intended marriage to be a union of body, mind, soul, and spirit between one man and one woman. Period. Now, when this account of the sons of Jacob is told later on, if indeed Moses is the one who writes it, that means it's after they have been delivered from Egyptian bondage, okay? Hundreds of years down the road. And these first people to hear the account of their history, they're already in 12 tribes. What a story this was, to hear about their roots. Shirley's done lots of research in her roots, her family tree. Suppose you go back on your family tree and you dig up this kind of stuff. This is the stuff that usually gets hidden in the closet. This is the kind of stuff that you don't tell your descendants. This is the kind of story that usually gets cleaned up in history. How did Israel come to be? Well, they were fathered by a lying trickster who appears in this story to be more of a buffoon than he is a hero. He's basically reduced to a stud who's servicing 4 women. I know that sounds crude, but that's basically what's happened in this story. He exercised no moral leadership with his wives that we have any account of. He didn't help them deal with their emotional wounds. Both of these women, they have emotional needs and wounds. We never hear him utter one word of support for them. And their moms, 2 sisters who saw their kids as nothing more than score in a competition. And out of this mess will come the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation of Israel, the family tree of Jesus. It's this mess of a family through which God promises to bless the world. It's crazy, isn't it? But you know what? To a degree that you and I probably never fully appreciate, God has done the same thing with the new Israel, with the church. We're a mess. Can we just admit that? We're a mess. And it's really the story of Romans chapter 5 and verse 20 that says, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Both these stories, the story of Israel and the story of the new Israel, they're stories of God making a silk purse